to our financial market course. This is Unit 2. We are going to consider interest rate structure and the rationale for financial markets. Specifically under Section 1, we are looking at risk structure of interest rates. So at the end of the session, you should be able to explain the concept of risk, explain how interest rates reflect risk, understand why risk is important to managers, as well as explain the components of risk, that is credit and liquidity risk. So when we talk about risk, we're talking about any uncertainty that occurs in transacting business. So individual securities vary in terms of interest rate charged on them. And the difference between the interest rates on two debt securities with the same term of maturity is the risk structure of interest rates. So when we talk about the risk structure of interest rates, we are talking about the difference between the interest rates on the two debt structures or securities that have the same term of maturity. So the circumstances or the characteristics of the borrower that may lead to the borrower not being able to pay the loan is called risk factor. So when we talk about risk factor, we are saying that any circumstance or characteristics that prevents the borrower from repaying the loan or the interest on the loan. All these circumstances are classified under risk factors. So in deciding what interest rates to demand for different borrowers, investors normally consider individual characteristics of the borrowers and their circumstances. So before any investor will decide on the amount of interest to be charged on the loan, from this concept we are learning that investors evaluate the ability of the borrowers to pay individually to be able to decide how much interest should be charged on the money they are being given. So the risk structure of interest rates explains the relationship between risk and interest rates on debt securities. So the risk structure of interest rates is important for managers of companies because it helps them understand what interest rates investors will demand. So here we are saying that the risk structure as well as the components or the characteristics of individuals' ability to repay back the loan as well as the interest on the loan helps managers to decide on the amount of interest they should charge on their loans. Financial institutions as well as their managers use the risk structure of interest rates to determine the interest rate to charge individual borrowers who apply for loans. So the risk factors commonly associated with individual debt securities are the default or credit risk as well as the liquidity risk and then the tax status of debt security. So we look at these individual risk factors short. We want to start with credit risk. So when we talk about credit risk, we are saying that is the inability or willingness of the borrower to repay the interest on the loan or even repay the principal amount of the loan itself. So for credit risk, we are saying that the borrower is not able to pay the principal amount that the investor gave out, or he's able to pay the principal amount but unable to pay the interest on the amount lent out. So investors demand a higher interest rate for debt securities that have a higher chance of defaulting in the future. So whenever investors perceive that borrowers have a higher rate to default on their risk, they charge a higher interest rate. So the difference between the interest rates on the government debt security and the corporate debt security of the same maturity period is also called the risk premium. And credit ratings also allow the borrower to offer an interest rate that reflects their ability to pay for their loans or their bonds. So for credit rating, we are saying that based on past experiences and the circumstances of the borrower, investors are able to project or know that this particular borrower would easily be able to pay the principal amount as well as the interest, or the borrower will default on paying either the principal amount or the interest. This depends on the investor's assessment on what the money is going to be used for, as well as the future prospects of the investment that the borrower wants to engage in. So, just as we have credit ratings, we also have bond ratings, and they are also used to determine the bond risk premium. So, investment grade bonds tend to have a lower risk premium or interest rate, and the junk bonds also tend to carry a higher interest rate. And we have already mentioned that whenever investors perceive that the possibility of default on a loan is high, higher interest rates are charged. So since investors believe that for junk bonds the possibility of default are high, a higher interest rate will be charged. They want to consider liquidity risk. So when we talk about liquidity, we are saying that it is the ease with which an asset can be converted into cash or cash equivalents. So liquidity risk is a risk that a security may be converted into cash but with a reduction in the value, or it will incur high costs in transaction. So with liquidity risk, you are saying that you want to convert an asset into cash, but in trying to convert it, you realize that the value of the asset falls, or you incur a high transaction cost. So there are times you lend out an asset, say a machinery to someone for the person to use, and you realize that when the person brings the machinery back, the value of the machinery has fallen, or even incur some cost to maintain the machinery. All these kind of issues fall under liquidity risk. So in addition to default or credit risk, investors also require a premium for liquidity. And because risk is a key factor in financial institutions and organizations, there are laws that govern its operation. So the tax law in Ghana makes provision for taxes on investment income. So investors will have to pay tax on any investment that is being made. And the effect of taxes is that tax reduces the amount of income that investors will ultimately receive. So aside the premium for default and liquidity risk, investors will also add a premium in deciding interest rates. So for an investor, before the investor will decide on the interest rates for a particular amount, or before he lends out a particular amount, you consider the credit risk, that is the inability of the consumer or the borrower to pay either the principal figure or the interest on it, as well as any losses that may be incurred whenever the investor wants to convert that asset into cash or cash equivalents. And we are saying here that because investors have to pay income tax or investment tax, they also consider all these things before they decide on how much the interest rate should be. So also soon we've come to the end of session 1. And in this session we've learned about interest rate risk as well as risk factors. We've learned that investors consider individual characteristics and circumstances before they determine the amount of interest to be charged on a particular loan. Also, investors also face income tax burden. So, in determining all these interest rates, they factor all these things in. Thank you and see you in our next session.